Hey guys. Tonight we're doing something a little different. So go ahead, dim the lights, stretch your legs, and settle into that oddly specific angle on your pillow that somehow only works once a year. Because tonight, we're drifting, very slowly, through the architectural history of New York City. It's the city that never sleeps, which is ironic because you are very much encouraged to fall asleep during this, preferably somewhere between the Dutch colonists and the part where steel frame construction becomes the hot new toy. No judgment. I won't even know. So, let's take a deep breath, sink into the quiet of the moment, and float back to a time before the word skyscraper even existed, before Times Square had screens blinding tourists into submission, before billionaires decided that ultra-thin pencil towers were the new hot flex. We're going back to when New York was, well, a marshy, mosquito-infested island that no one would describe as a global capital. Yet. Let's start at the very beginning. 17th century New Amsterdam. Picture it. A tiny Dutch settlement on the southern tip of Manhattan. The architecture? Think ships arrived and people nailed together whatever they could find. Wooden houses with steep gabled roofs, narrow little homes that looked less like future Wall Street and more like someone tried to recreate Amsterdam from memory after a long night of drinking. The Dutch had a vibe, a practical one. Brick where you could afford it, wood where you couldn't. And a lot of buildings that looked like they'd blow over if someone sneezed too hard. But still, there was order. Streets, sort of, a fort, a church, even a wall where, yes, Wall Street would later appear. Back then, it was literally a wall, which is honestly refreshing, because today, nothing on Wall Street resembles anything even slightly straightforward. The colony changed hands in 1664, and the English rolled in like, wow, nice place you've got here. We'll take it. And just like that, New Amsterdam became New York, with architecture that leaned more English modesty than Dutch charm. More brick, more little rows of houses, more of that very British approach to city building that says, let's make everything orderly, but also slightly damp and depressing. But the real story, the one we care about, starts later. Because New York's architecture didn't become iconic until people realized the island was small, the population was exploding, and the only logical direction to build was upward. Like, aggressively upward. But before we zoom into the clouds, we float gently into the 18th and early 19th centuries. So here's New York in the 1700s and early 1800s. Still young, still awkward, like a teenager trying to figure out its identity. You can see hints of grandeur because wealthy merchants were starting to flex their money. You'd get Georgian-style mansions, symmetrical, neat, very, let's pretend we're refined, along places like Pearl Street. Then Federal-style townhouses that were essentially the Georgian style but slightly more confident, with fan lights over the doorways and that air of, yes, I read books. Neighborhoods like Greenwich Village looked like cozy English towns, with low-rise streets, brick townhouses, and that charmingly crooked street grid that still confuses tourists and half the taxi drivers today. This was when architects, including those who'd never actually been to Europe, started copying European styles with the confidence of a student who skimmed the assignment 5 minutes before presenting. And in 1811, New York made a bold decision. The commissioner's plan laid out the rigid grid system for most of Manhattan. It was clean, logical, a little boring, and absolutely perfect for the future skyscraper jungle that would grow on top of it. The city was still low-rise, though. Heights were limited by, well, gravity and people's general desire not to climb 14 flights of stairs in 90-degree heat wearing 19th century wool outfits. Elevators weren't a thing yet, and no matter how bold an architect was feeling, no rich merchant was going to say, you know what I'd love? A building so tall it becomes a daily phi workout? So New York remained, for a time, horizontally ambitious. But change was coming. The mid-19th century brought immigration, industry, crowds, and the constant smell of horses. Truly a defining feature of the era. And with this came architecture that reflected a city trying to keep up, but also quietly panicking. Let's float gently into the cast iron era. So SoHo, long before it became the land of expensive designer boutiques and cafes where a latte cost more than rent in 1800s Manhattan, was home to a revolutionary architectural experiment, cast iron facades. Cast iron was cheap, easy to mold, and, most importantly, let architects pretend their buildings were decorated with elaborate stone carvings, even though they were basically using metal Legos for grown-ups. You get those iconic SoHo buildings with delicate columns, ornate fronts, and big windows, because cast iron could support them without collapsing into dust. These structures were the architectural equivalent of saying, we want to look fancy, but please don't ask us to pay stone prices. At the same time, New York started thinking bigger, and nothing screamed bigger than a giant, literal, massive park. Enter Central Park. In the 1850s, Frederick Olmsted and Calvert Vos designed what would become one of the most famous urban parks in the world. And yeah, it was deliberately romantic, deliberately scenic, and deliberately meant to make people forget that they were living in a rapidly industrializing, overcrowded city where you could probably get typhoid just by looking at a water pump wrong. The architecture inside the park, bridges, arches, pavilions, was picturesque. Nothing too tall, nothing too flashy. Just enough to make people feel serene, or at least mildly less stressed. For a moment, New York exhaled. Then it went right back to building. Let's drift now into what I like to call the age of ambition, which is the late 19th century, when New York realized it wasn't just a city anymore. It was the city, the financial center, the place immigrants passed through by the millions, the land where brick townhouses started looking embarrassingly short next to the steel frames rising around them. This is when New York started producing architecture with a kind of frantic confidence. Like a teenager who suddenly hits a growth spurt and decides to join 8 sports teams at once. Take the Brooklyn Bridge. Completed in 1883. A Gothic rival masterpiece. Massive stone towers, dramatic arches, steel cables everywhere. Half the population didn't believe it was structurally safe, but they walked across anyway because New Yorkers have always been powered by equal parts curiosity and stubbornness. Then came the skyscrapers. Actual skyscrapers, the very first. Not the glass giants we know today, but curious-looking constructions called Chicago school and commercial-style buildings, rectangular, efficient, and very proud of themselves. Early structures like the New York World Building and the Park Row Building showed off steel frame construction, elevators, and that new belief that the sky was not the limit. The sky was basically just a polite suggestion. So suddenly, a building wasn't impressive because it was decorated. It was impressive because it was tall. And as you can imagine, this triggered a sort of architectural arms race. Let's float into the early 20th century, arguably the most iconic architectural era New York has ever had. This is when the city becomes the backdrop to every vintage postcard, every Art Deco poster, and every romantic movie where someone stands on a rooftop dramatically staring at the skyline. This is where the architectural mood becomes, let's build tall, but make it gorgeous. Steel and elevators had unlocked height. Now architects wanted style. Enter Beaux-Arts and Art Deco. Beaux-Arts buildings like Grand Central Terminal, the New York Public Library, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art were designed with enough marble, columns, and ornamentation to make ancient emperors nod in approval. They screamed elegance, sophistication, and occasionally, we spent way too much money, but look how pretty it is. They were symmetrical, majestic, overly fancy in the best possible way. Then, in the 1920s and 30s, Art Deco arrived like a stylish guest who shows up to a party wearing a perfectly tailored suit and refuses to make eye contact with anyone less fashionable. Think the Chrysler building. All those geometric patterns, the metallic crown, the eagle gargoyles that look like they're judging you for not owning a luxury car. It was the definition of swagger, expressed in aluminum and steel. Then,